right, well, we're back. If you have ever studied your Freudian psychology, you might recognize the phrase free association. Free association is when you say whatever comes to mind when given a prompt. So in Freudian therapy, the prompt might be mother, and you're supposed to say whatever comes to mind whenever you think of your mother. Um, we usually don't do that in cognitive psychology, but we can allow a person to generate the first word that comes to mind in response to cues, right? So we've got these boy, large, night, salt, table, over. And you're supposed to say the first thing that comes to mind. On average, people tend to say certain kinds of words in response to these. So, boy, they tend to say girl. Large, they tend to say small. Night, they tend to say day. Salt, pepper, table, chair, over, under, more or less. Like these are really common responses. So, these are what we call paired associates. Free association like this, where people can say whatever comes to their mind, it kind of gives us a little bit of insight into how they've got information organized in their neural network, right? If you automatically, without effort, think girl when you hear the prompt boy, it kind of shows us that you've got those associated in your neural network, that you've got them stored closely in your neural network. And so these kinds of paired associates, we can also do categorical tests to reveal connections. So I can give you a prompt like animal, and you can say everything that comes to mind within a period of time. And the first ones that come out are ones that are most closely associated with that categorical title, animal, right? Or I might say tool, and you say everything that you think of that goes under tool. Back in the olden days of like the 1950s, there was a lot of interest in these kinds of word associations that people made, and there used to be, a lot of effort going into determining a good set of paired associates or a good set of categorical norms so that we could figure out, which things are on average strongly associated with each other. I say used to be because really they haven't really repaired these lists over the past like 75 years. There hasn't been really a lot of movement on making new lists of words and stuff. I think a lot of the research on verbal learning and verbal behavior, as they used to call it, has kind of gone out of style, and so they haven't really updated these things. Um, I've used these paired associates in my research, and so I know I've looked really hard to find out has anybody updated these lists. So they haven't. But what they've shown is that like 90% of people, the first thing that they say when they hear boy is they'll say girl, right? Like they've come up with the most common answers. And then there are some things that are called weaker associates, where maybe 60% of people will say a particular response given a prompt. And so now we know not everybody has these organized together, right? And so we can get some degree of evidence for like common neural networks. We can do this idiosyncratically, where we give you the prompts and we see what you've got associated. Like the more quickly you respond with something, the more closely associated those things probably are in your neural network. And so this kind of structure gives us some insight into how people have information organized in their brains. Now, when we retrieve information, it kind of illustrates this encoding specificity principle, where we find that memory is best when the retrieval condition matches the encoding condition. So encoding, of course, is when you were learning the material or when you first experienced the material, and then retrieval is when you're being asked to, produce the material, right? Pull it from your memory. Godden and Badley 1965 did a study where they got some scuba divers. So these were people who already were comfortable scuba diving. It wasn't like they took college undergraduates and stuck them underwater in a scuba gear. These were scuba divers, and they had some of them learn a list of words on water, underwater. I'm sorry, underwater. They are not floating, underwater, and then they retrieved those words while they were back on land. Others, they had them learn the words while they were on land and then retrieve the words while they were underwater. And what you can see is that there's not much difference in their performance, right? That the water land slash land water people did just about the same performance. It didn't really matter. Where we see a difference is when the contexts match. So if you learned it underwater and you got tested underwater, you did way better than either of those situations where you had different contexts. Now, of course, land did much better than the water, right? Like you, there must be, even if you're an experienced scuba diver, something a little bit stressful about learning underwater and being tested underwater that, inhibits retrieval to some extent. Whereas being back on land, for both of those things, you do better. Going into it, Godden and Badley kind of thought that you would always do better if you could be tested on land, and we can see that's not the case, right? If you learn underwater and then you're tested on land, you do way worse than if you are learning on land and testing on land. So the key thing seems to be having matching contexts. They had thought it would be easier to take a test on land, but what they're finding is no, context needs to match, right? So we find that there's greater recall when the learning context and the testing context were the same based on this Godden and Badley study. So why is that? What's happening? Why are they remembering better when the contexts match? Well, here's a little example from more modern research. This is from 2000. And so in the columns, we see different stimuli being presented. So in the left-hand column, they saw one picture. In the middle column, saw a different picture. And then in the right-hand column, they listened to a sound. So they had different stimuli based, each column represents a different stimulus. And then, so like picture A and picture B are the same, I'm sorry, panel A and panel B are the same picture. Panel C and panel D are the same picture. E and F are the same sound. So just to give you, the columns are the consistent thing. And then here's their brain during encoding. And you can see when looking at picture A, there's a lot of activity across the occipital lobe. Everybody's looking up at the ceiling in these pictures. So this is the back of the brain. The occipital lobe has a lot of activity for picture A, a little less activity for picture B. And then for the sound stimulus, you see a lot of activity in the auditory cortex, right? So this is how their brains are reacting to the actual stimulus. Then we come down here to this row and we see how their brains are reacting when they're retrieving that stimulus. Like, that moment when you're retrieving information and it almost feels like you're seeing it again or you're hearing it again, like you feel like you're looking at something on a screen or something like that. Well, you can see there's a lot less activity on picture A than there had been for actual picture A. So the retrieval process only activates part of the occipital lobe, but in the same basic area, right? And you see that again with picture B, right? Actually, picture B has a little bit more activity than picture A, which had so much activity, right? So we see, but same basic areas, right? And then we come over here to the sound, and again, same basic areas are being activated. But interestingly, this is actually a really interesting finding that when it's a sound-based one, you'll notice it's mostly the left side that's reacting when it's time to retrieve the information. And that little piece of information has been being used to try and figure out if we can tell who's having a false memory. Like if you really remember it, you tend to activate the left side. And if you are, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say it, incorrectly retrieving something that you never really experienced, you'll see activity in the right side. So that seems to only be the case with sound, by the way, not with visual stuff. Anyway, but you'll notice on this picture A, it's the left side too, but picture B, we don't see that. So for visual stuff, the pattern's not as clear. But for the sound, it seems like it's pretty clear that the left side gets activated again, as if it's the same, the same part of the auditory cortex as was stimulated in the actual experience. So encoding specificity argues that when you're in a particular context, that context becomes part of the memory that you store. So if you learned a list of words underwater, being underwater is part of the context that you store along with the words. And so that's why it's really super important that you are in the same context for memory as you were for encoding. So let's look at this part again, right? So if you're underwater, that's going to serve as a cue when you go to retrieve it underwater. Now think about this when you take, I don't know how many of you have had classes where you actually take your exams in the classroom, because a lot of students are telling me they haven't done that. But in case you have, hopefully you have, the actual classroom where you were learning the material serves as a partial cue for the material that you're trying to retrieve. I think I mentioned earlier that I wasn't the world's greatest studier. I didn't do a lot of reading outside of class. I didn't know how to organize things. I didn't. I was a terrible studier when I first started college, and but I attended every single lecture. Like, I never missed class. And one of the benefits of that is that the classroom serves as a cue, right? It serves as context so that the material that I learned had that specificity associated with the classroom. So as I would read a question, I could kind of look around the classroom, and it would help to generate maybe my recollection of when the teacher talked about it, or maybe what the picture looked like that was up on the board, or those kinds of things, right? And so having a match between where you're encoding the information and then where you're retrieving the information is really important. So if you know that you have to take your tests in class, you should probably come to class as often as you possibly can and benefit from that encoding. A lot of students, when they are in a class that doesn't have an attendance policy, they go right on, I'm not going to class, I'll just read my book. And you can completely read your book and completely know your information backwards and forwards, but you're going to be having that little gap where you don't have that additional context cue to help you to retrieve information. So you're kind of just, it can end up harming your grade. I know I've had classmates who are like, oh, it doesn't matter, I'm studying really hard, it'll be the same, it doesn't matter. And it's possible that it does matter. Okay, I think I've been talking long enough, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we'll talk about spreading activation in the next video.